Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrian Calamo. I am a fellow at the Arabian Peninsula Institute. And today we're going to be discussing the topic for today is could Yemen's Houthis pose a new threat to the Middle East? I think if you ask our hosts, that question should have been asked 15 years ago. We pretty much know the answer to that. One of the big questions that we're going to be discussing that's kind of a subtopic is can the U.S. and Southern Transitional Council, and we'll go into detail about them. Is there a partnership? Can we form a partnership with them to combat the Houthis to make sure that at least they don't advance their gains? So today we have joining us David Wormser, who's a former lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy. He was senior advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. He's got a PhD from Johns Hopkins, and his CV is extremely long. We also have Jiang Sanknik, who works at TAMC Solutions. They are a company an agency that's focused on intelligence, risk management, for basically mitigating security risks for private companies. And Jiang, if I get some of that wrong, please correct me. And then finally, Amir Al-Bid, who is a political advisor and spokesperson for the Southern Transitional Council. So I am very happy to have the three of you with me today to discuss some of these issues and talking points that we'll be looking at. So before I turn it over to our guests, what I want to do is provide a little context for everybody that's listening in about who are the Houthis. I think it's important to put some context around the Houthis in relation to Yemen, the country that they call their homeland and that they operate in, the regional relationships, how they operate with the other Gulf countries, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then look at the Houthis in the context of October 7th attacks by Hamas. So if Yemen, looking at them, the Houthis in the context of Yemen, they are a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran that seized the north over basically a decade-long civil war. It was brutal. They now control the northern half of the country. And in that northern half of the country, you have Sana'a, the port of Hodeidah, large swaths or stretches of the Red Sea coast. And they also threaten the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Inside the country, they've had a monopoly on violence. What they've done is militarize mosques, use child soldiers, rape as a weapon, human shields, the war crimes that we see coming out of, let's say, Gaza. Now, as far as terrorist activities outside of their borders, they continuously launch attacks against civilian sites, commercial sites in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, using Scud missiles, Scud missile variants, drones, and caused some casualties, killed people. And for that, they were put on the Foreign Terrorist Organization list, a list that they were on. But right around 2020, 2021, it seemed like the Houthi war machine stalled out. And when they stalled out, it's not so much a manpower issue, I think, or firepower, it's more of a manpower issue. They were not able to break a siege in Marib. You also had the formulation of the Southern Transitional Council, which has worked as a counterbalance against this Houthi aggression and them rampaging and taking all of Yemen and putting it into the Islamic Republic's fold. And then finally, I'll look at the October 7th attacks, Hamas, Houthis, Hezbollah, the Iraqi proxies such as Kataib Hezbollah. They all answer to the Islamic Republic. So when the Houthis are firing Scud missiles that are aimed at the UAE, taken down, aimed at Israel, or aimed at US naval ships and taken down, there is a serious escalation here. This is an escalation that the question is, do the Houthis have any agency here, or is this part of a concerted front run by the Islamic Republic, a war by proxy against Israel and the Gulf states in the region? So my first question, I'm going to put this one out to you, David. I think this kind of starts back to where a decision was made. A decision was made to take the Houthis off the foreign terrorist organization list. Can you explain to us the broad implications of doing that and what that did for a level of deterrence from the United States, what that did as far as kind of giving the Houthis a free hand in the region, in Yemen?
Well, one of the things you mentioned in your introduction was that the Houthis had sort of stalled out at that point, roughly the same period of time. And you I think quite accurately and perceptibly noted that it was a manpower issue. The manpower issue is ultimately also a financial issue. Namely, you need to pay your operatives, and they need to have the money to do what they need to do. And when you're on the terror list, there's a lot of severe restrictions and so forth that choke your ability to have access to money, have access to banking, have access to SWIFT system, and so forth. So money moves with great difficulty. The second thing is, in the background, at the same time, you had the continued sanctions on Iran, which were very strictly enforced. And Iran, at this point, had reached a point of near bankruptcy. They were down, I believe, only to $4 billion in foreign reserves, which is minuscule. So essentially, in one fell swoop, by taking the Houthis off the terror list, and we didn't lift any sanctions right off, but we stopped aggressively enforcing them. And specifically, the oil trade that Iran had. Suddenly, oil was flowing again, and with that, revenue was flowing, and Iran began its climb out of its financial disaster that was reaching bankruptcy. So all of a sudden, through these lifting of measures, money started flowing again to the Houthis. Money started flowing again to all these proxies across the region. And you began to turn around the strategic momentum of the region. Iran turned it around and began to take the initiative and began to create a regional momentum in its favor strategically. And the Houthis, of course, played a very important role. And because of that, you started seeing more aggressive behavior from them. Now, they had done some things in the previous administration too, but I think this now, with the October 7th attack on Israel, the response and the Houthi response, and by the way, they a week ago also killed several Saudi soldiers. I think what you're seeing is the Houthis are embarking on a much more aggressive policy again, because ultimately Iran is on the march, and they are a reflection of Iranian power.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, they were down to 4 billion in their foreign currency reserves, and I believe the number they now put it as 121 billion in foreign currency reserves, and that's just from not enforcing sanctions. So I think what I'll do is I'll turn to Amir on this one, and because you see this, you're there, you're in Yemen. How have you seen a significant shift in the playing field? What's been happening in the battle space because of that influx of money, influx of cash?
Thank you first. I would when it comes to the Houthis, I mean, their stances now when it comes to surprisingly, everyone is surprised that they launched these attacks on Israel or something like that. This is something that's been saying, the Houthis been saying for a long time, and this is not new. And they are part of this group, part of this axis, what they call it, axis of resistance that belongs to Iran. So this is not something new. And when the war started between Israel and Hamas in after 7th of October, we realized that the Houthis will be part of that. We thought definitely that they will be part of this because they are part of this network. They were when I'll go back to your question about what were they doing. The situation in Yemen for the last 1 year, there was like lots of talks between the Saudis and the Houthis, and they were going to reach an agreement on ceasefire, and we've been vocally talking about this, that it's important that we have a ceasefire in Yemen, but the important thing that we don't empower the Houthis using this kind of ceasefire or using any political agreement. And this is the thing that we don't want, and we don't want giving them money to mobilize again. As you know, we in as an STC, STC is a political and military organization in South Yemen. We are part of the international recognized government. Also, our president is a vice president of Yemen at the same time. And we do counterterrorism, helping with the help of the UAE and also the USA. But at the same time, there is a balance of power that's there in Yemen, especially since last year, and there is no one is moving. But with the peace process that helping or empowering the Houthis, then the balance of power will be shifted, and this is what we don't want. Because then the Houthis now are advancing in the strategic missiles. They have strategic missiles. They can reach different places. But the more dangerous part of it is if there is a shift in the balance of power, and they can go back to Bab al-Mandab, to go back to Aden, port of Aden, and they have an access over the Arab Sea. This is another dynamic that Iran will reach, which is not just the Houthis controlling whole of Yemen, but also affecting the region, affecting the international maritime route, and having more influence. So that's our position here, that we were on the verge to reach a ceasefire with the help of the Saudis, but it's important that if you want to reach a ceasefire, that it won't empower the Houthis and give them leverage over there, and shifting the balance of power that's been happening for the last 6 months.
Yes, Amir, I'm going to come back to you in a second on the Saudis, because I have a number of questions there. But I think this is a good time to turn over to Chang, and because you were talking about maritime security here, and I think for Americans, a lot of what you hear in Yemen, they can't place it on a map, and it's an over there problem. All right, but can you explain to this how there has been a shadow war taking place in the Red Sea? It is really getting hot there right now. What happens if all of a sudden the Houthis do shift the balance of power and can choke off the Bab el-Mandeb Strait? What I see disaster scenarios, but I'm not an expert in economics and looking at at those type of risks.
So October 7 has been a turning point for the entire region, not only for Israel and the Palestinian territories or their immediate neighbors, but it has also been a turning point in our understanding of Yemen and in our understanding of Houthis. So most of the advocates for the peace process in Yemen and an agreement between the Saudi Arabia-led coalition and the Houthis would argue that the arsenal that the Houthis have in Sana'a and northern Yemen were for purposes of warfare in Yemen only. That to the extent of the claims that the ballistic and drone attacks reaching towards the Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia were mere acts of self-defense by Houthis, who, in quotation marks, have been waging a war to protect themselves from ongoing coalition airstrikes, the economic blockade, the blockade of the airport. But in 2023, now we know that the arsenal that has been built with or without Iranian help in Yemen is designated to be used in regional wars. That was a clear indication that Houthis in Yemen are not indifferent to what's happening in the region. And they are ready to fulfill the responsibilities given to them by the Iranian regime, very much mimicking what happened in the first Gulf War, as the Saddam regime was firing ballistic missiles towards Israel. The Houthis, they used the military capabilities that have built thanks to the crisis in Yemen to intervene in another crisis in the region. I think it is itself is an alarming situation for everyone to understand. As Ahmed also said, anything that's happening in Yemen, the peace process, and every other transaction with the Houthis and the rest of the Yemenis should not be tools for the further empowerment of Houthis. But the question, as you ask, what they could do, is actually very much obvious. That the security of trade routes through the maritime trade routes, the security of naval trade routes are in jeopardy because of both the military and economic capabilities that have been given to Houthis in the past 10 years, ever since the coup d'etat happened in Sana'a, and mostly because of the coalition's reluctance at the moment to continue the warfare with Houthis, fearing that that they would be abandoned by the West, especially by the US and their allies, in a potential war with Iran. So I believe in the past month, it has been obvious for us to know that Iran has been flexing its muscles through all of its proxies. That included Iraqi Hashd-e-Sha'bi militias, that included the Houthis in Yemen, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, in more of a sign that all Iranian proxies will be ready to engage in a war if a regional war breaks out. So although the Houthi attacks on Israel and in the Red Sea have been more symbolic over the past few weeks and did not inflict any big losses, I think it's important to understand what's happening in Yemen will have a direct consequence for everyone trying to prevent a regional war and everyone trying to keep the functionality of the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and all other maritime traders open. That said, it's the first time that Israel has now deployed naval units to prevent continued attacks from northern Yemen. We might soon see that Israel would be compelled to use air power on especially rocket launching sites from Yemen. So the war will not end very soon. By this, I don't mean the war in Gaza. The war in Gaza Strip may end in a few months, but the regional tensions that were ignited on October 7 will continue. So anyone who's preparing for defending the interests of the West, defending the interests of Israel, or defending the interests of non-belligerent partners in the region will now have to take Houthis into consideration.
Great, thank you, Chang. David, I'm going to go back over to you with a question about the Houthis, the foreign terrorist organization list, their strikes that have been coming towards that we've taken down in defensive measures here. Is there a line that they can cross where they get put on the foreign terrorist organization list, back on the list, which they were removed from by this administration? And is that a first step to saying, we're kind of taking you seriously here?
I think the Saudis would love nothing more than that, as well as some others, because it begins to control and cap the power that they can amass on some level. I mean, it isn't a solution to the problem, but it helps. But my fear is that Washington hasn't yet fully digested the consequences of what's happened in Gaza. They're still looking at it as a localized conflict between the specific terrorist organization, Hamas, in Israel, maybe even between Gaza and Israel, but they haven't yet understood that this was a strategic event that Iran is behind. And by that, I don't mean that Iran woke up and said, pushed a button and ordered Hamas to do it. But Iran trained and built Hamas to the organization it did in preparation for an attack like this. Whether this was the day they wanted or not is irrelevant. Hamas had become the strategic instrument of Iranian power. And the whole point of that was essentially to make the point that Israel was wounded, it's limping, it's weak, its image of power and competence is a myth, and it's falling apart, and that Iran is the nation ascendant. Now, why did Iran do that? Iran did that because actually, when you look at the pre-October 7th environment, they were facing some very dangerous, deteriorating circumstances. You had the Abraham Accords peace treaties, you had the Saudi rapprochement with Israel heading toward peace. I was skeptical there was going to be a formal peace in the next year, but there is a lot of strategic cooperation and really a lot of anything but peace activities between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which essentially strategically made the opposite momentum or created the opposite momentum than Iran wants, which is that it's on the advance, Israel's collapsing, America's collapsing, America's fickle, etc. So this war, in part, I believe, was done strategically to put Israel on the defensive, to put the West on the defensive as part of a larger strategic attempt to seize the momentum and create the image that the Western Bloc, the Saudis, the UAE, Bahrain, etc., Israel, the United States, are in retreat. Now, if you come to that conclusion, then it's frankly a no-brainer to put the Houthis on the terrorist list. Moreover, Washington will have to change its policy toward Iran, which is essentially they shouldn't be going toward another deal that further empowers their nuclear program or so forth. Very much the macro of the micro in Yemen. Yeah, maybe some arrangements, but not those that could help Iran be empowered. But when you look at American policy right now and its focus on deterrence, you still see that it hasn't really shifted the paradigm. That in the end, they still believe that that you cannot get around the fact that you have to come to terms with Iran in order to calm the region down. So there's a strategic divide emerging, I think, between the Israelis, the Saudis, and others, and the United States, which still lives in the pre-October 7th paradigm, and the rest, which are living now in a new paradigm. Eventually, I think Washington will come around, possibly by enough pain inflicted by Iran. We've had already more than 40 attacks on American soldiers in Iraq, Syria. So they may push it. But I think at the core of the decision to put the Houthis back on the terrorist list and take a more aggressive policy towards sanctions and choking that camp, and somehow wrenching maybe the situation in Yemen away from the strategic march ahead of Iran, I think that will still require a much greater strategic shift of mind in Washington.
Okay, great point there, David. And that strategic shift of mind. We mentioned the Islamic Republic, and yes, absolutely. They created Hezbollah and have used that cookie cutter model to shape all their proxies throughout the region, including the Houthis, which are the last piece of that puzzle. The Houthis have a state sponsor and also sponsors, because we know that the Islamic Republic triangulates with Russia, China, North Korea, all these other bad actors. And here's my question to Amir. Looking at the Southern Transitional Council right now, in the Presidential Leadership Council, the real only backing that you have is United Arab Emirates at this point. And for me, I'm going to ask you, does the U.S. need to first recognize the issue here that this is all directed out of the Islamic Republic and this is a proxy of theirs and they have very little agency? And then second of all, could the U.S. put some skin in the game here and finally realize that some help can go a long way to helping the Southern Transitional Council?
It's a great question, Adrian. When it comes to the to who's backing the PLC, for sure it's Saudi Arabia and UAE. But as an STC, we are with the UAE doing counterterrorism operations in our areas. As you know, the STC is is one of the main three powers in Yemen. That it's two of them are radical Islamists, which is the Muslim Brotherhood and the Houthis, and then you have the STC. So so we have two fronts here. We're countering the Houthis, and at the same time we are countering the fundamentalists like ISIS and Al Qaeda. So when it comes to the should be there more attention? Yes, for sure. Because normally, I mean, for the last 5 years, probably the last 2 years, there were more attention as they appointed the special envoy, Mr. Tim Lindekin, to Yemen. But it needs more. We need more attention from the states on this region, as it's a very strategic. And we know that if you want to stop the war, as I mentioned before, we need to stop the war, but not to shift the balance of power. So at least make sure that the Houthis are kept in their areas and not expanded in our areas. So that's for sure something that we need all the international community to pay attention to. We need to know that's all linked. It's not just about Yemen, it's about the region. For sure, from our perspective, we don't want the Houthis to overrule our constituencies, and no one wants a divine that kind of theocratic rule or on our areas. But at the same time, this will have an effect over Saudis, effect over the international community too, and this will and so that's the thing that we need to emphasize. The Yemeni, the American, the US to have more attention to have because they have an ally already on the ground.
Yeah. And the follow-up question with Saudi Arabia in the kingdom, they just had soldiers killed on the border by the Houthis. And you can probably talk to whether that ceasefire that they've had is actually they're living to the rules of the ceasefire. My question would be, is there a way to peel the Saudis away from these I would say they're purely tactical and not strategic deals with the Houthis and with the Islamic Republic, because I believe at the end of the day, the Islamic Republic wants the kingdom to fall. And I think most people would agree with that.
For sure, that's their strategic rule, but at the same time, first they wanted to detach the Saudis from the American, then they'll make it fall. But first they have to detach the backers from it, and that's what they're trying to do to make them have more allies. Have better solutions with the Houthis, more agreements with the Iranians a bit, and more to bring in China to the game, and to create this kind of momentum in this region. But for sure, after 7th of October, there is a shift in the dynamic. There is a new chapter that showed their faces and to the world that we need to have a new strategy in this region. We can't abandon this region. We need to be back to this region and make sure that we have a new security alliances based on the new facts.
And Zhang, I'm going to go to you as an impartial observer on this. Do you think the STC is the best solution to keeping some semblance of a state that isn't overrun by a tyranny in Yemen?
Well, the Yemen crisis since 2015 has produced two winners. One is the Houthis, the other is the STC. So we definitely are facing a two camps in Yemen and two winners, and we will have to make a decision who to support. STC is one of the, we know why Houthis have won and what happened, especially with the resumption of direct negotiations with Saudi Arabia. No one can deny that the Houthi position is way more stronger than a few years ago, and their impunity may just continue, especially if the US is not taking a position that could at least remedy some of Saudi Arabia's concerns in the region, which are in my opinion, the main motivators for Saudi Arabia to ease its rhetoric towards the Houthis. But the second winner of this war is the STC. STC was able to emerge as a strong and unified actor. And not only that, it was able to unify so many southern factions under its umbrella. In its recent position with the PLC also shows that that STC is at least a second option for the world to look at, and to at least save some of Yemen in the south from being any part of the Iranian axis. So I believe, yes, the STC is a strong factor in the region, and it's also merely a decision: do we want to be with the moderates? Do we want to have Yemen, or at least southern Yemen, to be governed by a pro-Western or at least pro-civilization actor like STC is?
Thank you, and I'm gonna throw this question out to both David and everyone, Amir, David, Zhang. Looking at we've mentioned a lot about the Houthis. Amir, you brought up within the Presidential Leadership Council, there is that Islamist group, like you have al-Islah and some of these other groups that are not on the moderate side. Looking at that makeup that you have in the dynamics of in Yemen right now. You have the Houthis to the north, pressing and kind of in a hold pattern with the STC. But before this October 7th flare-up, I saw a lot of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP coordination, attacking the STC around the different rims to protect civilized people. Do you see Al-Qaeda, Houthi coordination on the ground, or do you imagine that is going on?
I'll just very quickly, I'll leave the specific one about the Houthis, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda, Saudi Arabia, but you know, one should take very seriously the Hamas-Iran coordination, because Hamas ultimately is Muslim Brotherhood, Sunni, etc., and there's Iran, the leader of the sort of the Shiite Islamist radical faction, and yet they're working very closely together here. And you see the role of Hezbollah with both Sunni and Islamist factions. So I think for greater strategic purposes, Iran has successfully breached that divide. And therefore, one could expect the Houthis to be able to coordinate as well. But I'll leave whether that's actually happening to the ones, to Osama and so forth, who know this, frankly, better than I do.
Amir, any comments?
Yep, I totally agree, and this coordination has been happening. I mean, for a long time, as we know, the stems of the ideology of Wilayat al-Faqih in Iran stems from the Muslim Brotherhood. So it comes, they have that link from that time. So in Yemen specifically, we have seen that there is coordination between Al-Qaeda and the Houthis, where we've 2-3 months ago, one of our leaders, of counterterrorism leaders in Abyan, got blown by one of the bombs, and the technique that was used there is specifically, it's a Houthi technique. that been used, and also the Houthis use drones at the same time. The Qaeda used drones in our troops. When you see the techniques that have been using, it's obviously that there is coordination between them and the Houthis, and that's what we have seen for especially the last 4 months, I would say.
Great. Chang, any comments on that one? No.
Well, sooner or later, Houthis will attack the south. Sooner or later, they will try to capture Aden, and sooner or later, they will try to annihilate the PLC and STC and other southern factions. In that kind of war, there will be a necessity to cooperate with other factions on the ground, and Al Qaeda is one of them. So even if there would be no direct cooperation, which I believe there is direct cooperation in certain places in Yemen between Houthis and Al Qaeda, there will be a high level of tolerance from the Houthis towards Al Qaeda launching these attacks. So it is more about the balance of power on the ground than ideological alliances, which I believe, I agree with David about the ideological flexibility of Iran when it comes to its regional proxies. It has been a strong supporter of even Al-Qaeda factions in Iraq, like Ansar al-Sunnah and others that were harbored by Iran for long years. So it will not surprise anyone that there will be some sort of a cooperation or understanding between an Iranian proxy and the Al-Qaeda linked organizations in Yemen. But as I said, it's more about the balance of power on the ground in Yemen, and sooner or later there will be a war against the south by the Houthis. So in that war, any faction that will be willingly joining the offensive against the south, against the legitimate government of Yemen and the southern factions, will be tolerated or even supported by Iran and regional actors. We can't know if Al Qaeda will remain as an actor in the prospective Houthi-controlled Yemen at some point. We can't know that, but at least it's fair to say that in the event of a war against the South, so many other factions will join, and Iran will be turning a blind eye to those groups.
Thanks. And I think we all have to remember that Saif al-Adil, who's now, for all intents and purposes, the head of Al Qaeda, he was living in Tehran with Soleimani Mughniya for 20 years after the Kenya and Tanzania bombings. So, okay, that brings us to a great point. That brings us back to what's going on October 7th, Hamas, the ideological game. Looking at the battle scene, we had Nasrallah give a speech the other day. There's two messages. There's one for the Arab Street. There's one for the Western Street. The one on the Western Street said he threw Hamas under the bus. The one for the Arab Street, his followers, sound like a message to incitement. He's giving another message on the 11th. Obviously, with the capabilities that the Hezbollah has in Lebanon, all eyes are going to be on Hezbollah. They're watching them, which always gives me a major concern that you got to watch these other fronts, mainly the Iraqi militias, Kata'ib Hezbollah, the Hash militia, those groups, but the Houthis especially. And the Houthis have long-range capabilities in their arsenal. Are you expecting a Houthi escalation in the Israeli conflict, in the Hamas conflict?
I'm actually expecting, I mean, there already is an escalation. I think we've had already 5 or 6 rounds of Houthi missiles fired at Israel, none reached, but not missiles, waves of missiles. I think the first wave was actually 19 missiles and drones and so forth. So we already have that escalation. I would note that yesterday in the UN, Israeli Ambassador Erdogan submitted to the Security Council a letter essentially saying that the Houthis had crossed the line and that anything obtaining hereforth should be considered an act of self-defense by Israel. Now, one could say this is deterrence, but the thing that's odd about it is it was put in the past tense, not the future tense. Namely, what Yemen has already done justifies Israeli actions of self-defense, rather than if Iran does, Israel will be justified. So I think what you're seeing is the preparation, at least diplomatically and intellectually, for Israel to take more direct action against Yemen. And Yemen, of course, has been taking direct action against Israel. As far as the Shabab, the various factions in Iraq, I'd note yesterday, Iraqi factions fired a missile at Israel from Iraq. It again was shot down, and they've also launched apparently one or two attempts at a terrorist infiltration across Israel's borders in the last week or two, and they're demanding of Jordan to let them through, which of course would destabilize Jordan. So we see already a great deal of activity from Iraq. Literally at this point, Iran is the only one who isn't sacrificing itself. It's fighting through every Arab rather than sacrificing itself at this point. But then if you go back to this central strategic competition, this is also very dangerous for Iran, because if Israel begins to act strategically, it's like the Saudis. It's basically behaved tactically mostly until now. It's responded to Hamas in Gaza, and it's trying to keep the escalatory lid on Lebanon and Syria. But if it responds strategically and says, okay, if Iran wants to have a strategic competition, and Israel begins to really cut into Iran's strategic assets, Hezbollah, Syria, potentially even the Syrian regime, and so forth. At that point, you're beginning to see the emergence of a momentum in the other direction that works to the advantage of the STC, to the Saudis, to the UAE, and it essentially recreates exactly what Iran feared on the eve of this war, is the creation of a unified front. And that can even operate without America, quote, getting it yet. If the Israelis actually turn that corner, and my sense is they mentally already have, they're just sequencing fronts to some extent. At this point, you could see the strategic momentum shift. And while it would be difficult for the Saudis to fully embrace an Israeli strategic offensive like that, I think deep down, the Saudis and others will understand that if that shifts the regional strategic balance, that shifts everything, including the situation in the Yemenite theater as well.
And I think that's kind of where we were when the Islamic Republic was down to 4 billion in their foreign currency reserves. Everything's been tilted. It's been shifted, and it's been shifted in the wrong way. And you can put it. There's multiple reasons why. I guess that's a discussion for another day. But I'm going to turn to you, Amir. Do you see with the Houthis, and they tried to assassinate another member today, was a member of the Presidential Leadership Council?
No, that was he's the head of the one of the leaders of the military of they tried to assassinate him. But the thing that's happening right today, there is something else that's happening today, is that the Houthis just claimed that they shot down an American drone, an MQ-9 drone. This is a new escalation that they really took another level of escalation from the Houthis on the American front.
Thank you. Okay. Those are all great points. The last one last one I wanted to bring up is, I've seen, and this may fall out of, Cheng may be the best person to answer this. There's been a lot of airstrikes in, as well as David, there's been a lot of airstrikes in hitting airports in Aleppo, Damascus. Do you have, we mentioned Iraq, we mentioned the Houthis. Do you have concerns about the Golan Heights, about that theater as well, opening another front on that level?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Cheng, you first. Okay, I'll very quickly. It's already to some extent active. There are missiles being fired from Syria into Israel. There's been several infiltration attempts and so forth. The Israelis have hit, as you said, airports, but more importantly, the 4th and 5th Division of the Syrian army are surrounding the Druze in Jebel Druze in Suwaida, which is about 100 kilometers from the Golan Heights. They're in revolt, and that's about 750,000 people, maybe a fewer because of the refugees, but still an extremely large population in revolt against Syria. And they've talked about maybe having a corridor to Israel or so forth. But what's very interesting is there were 2 Israeli airstrikes that suggest a strategic purpose. They hit the main intersection. They were 2 brigades that were detached from the 4th and 5th divisions, Syrian divisions, and they were based in Isra and another major intersection that really connects Damascus to the south and the whole Damascus Golan theater to the eastern part of Iraq, Syria. And the Israelis hit and obliterated the Syrian forces in those 2 intersections, effectively, at least for a moment, cutting off the Iraqi theater and the Syrian theater on the Golan Heights. So you see the Israelis already in slow motion undertaking strategic moves. It already is an active front, and quite frankly, I think Hezbollah may prefer to fight on that front because it doesn't have to sacrifice Lebanon to do that.
Yep. Chang, you're gonna say?
So I'm less and less concerned as the time goes by. It was a big concern in the initial days of the conflict after October 7, and it could have been catastrophic for everyone. I'm saying this because Israel was attacked, what was caught in a surprise attack on October 7. It took Israel almost 3 days to clear its own territory, and some estimates put that even an area way larger than Gaza was infiltrated by Gaza-based organizations, Hamas and Islamic Jihad leading it, but some other organizations in that too. It's not for no reason that the US has deployed 2 carrier strike groups and a nuclear submarine to the Eastern Mediterranean, because it's not only about keeping Israel safe, it's not only about protecting Israel, it's also there to create a deterrence to prevent a regional war. Because in case of a multi-front war against Israel, with an all-in Iranian proxies from Lebanon and Syria, Israel could have resorted to mass destruction weapons to protect itself. That could be the end for the regional peace. So I believe that threat is partially contained at the moment with the U.S. presence there and clear messages from Washington that any other parties that might engage in this war will be responded to. However, the risk is there, as they say. Everybody makes plans until the war starts, but you don't know what plans you can make after the war starts. So anybody could find themselves in a regional war without any plans there. So Iran has a lot to lose in certain countries. Iran has a lot to lose in Syria. David also mentioned the airports, the oil infrastructure, the trade routes, the military infrastructure that Iranians have been using hand in hand with the Russians and the Syrian military are big assets to lose. I believe the same logic applies to Houthis in Yemen. They have a lot to lose. I mean, losing the Sana'a airport to an Israeli airstrike will be catastrophic for Houthis or other commercially, financially, or militarily important assets in Yemen could be jeopardized and could be easily hit by Israel and the US if there will be a regional war. So I believe there is a tier of belligerents. The first tier is the Hamas and Islamic Jihad and their allies on the Gaza Strip. They already engaged in the war. The second tier could be Hezbollah, for which Iran has less to lose. They don't have a military infrastructure or a commercial financial infrastructure for Iran to be really concerned of. And then the third tier is Syria. Changing the regime in Damascus is definitely in the within the powers of the US and Israel with just one airstrike. So that could be catastrophic for the entirety of the Iranian plans in the region. In short, concerns are we're not as concerned as the beginning. I think the deterrence has been established to some extent, but there is always such a risk, and the deterrence should continue until the Israeli mission in Gaza Strip will conclude.
Thanks, Cheng. Okay, I've got one last question I want to throw out to everybody, but I want Amir's take on this first. I have my answer to this, but is it in the U.S. national interest to support the STC and the Southern forces to make sure Yemen is not going to export chaos to the rest of the region?
As I explained before, it's important to, as you know, Yemen is the main three powers in Yemen are two radical Islamists and the STC, which is a more secular-based values organization that's mainly functioning in South Yemen, and it's important that we don't let the Houthis to expand to these strategic areas, and this is why I think we have to, based on the values, based on the security matters, we need to collaborate, cooperate with the together to have some kind of a security alliances in this region, and to have a sustainable peace in that region, though it will be very, very difficult with the network that the Iranians are installing in this region.
Cheng?
Well, I mean, American foreign policy interests, in my opinion, are different, of course. So, personally, opinion, yes, I believe every pro-Western and pro-civilization factor in the region should be supported. That includes STC. And obviously in Yemen, we're down to two choices. We're down to supporting the Houthis, or directly or indirectly, or we support a legitimate government that involves STC to gradually take over the captured areas. But even if that's not a possibility in the short term, there should be an option to protect southern Yemen and to protect the footing of STC with the other organizations. And as I said, I believe STC is the second winner in the Yemen crisis. I don't say this is a positive thing. I wish the Yemen crisis never happened, but it happened, and it has two winners, Houthis and the STC. I think it all starts with the U.S. Gulf relations, U.S.-Saudi Arabia relations. And that's the chain effect happening. So the U.S. may not have direct relations with STC anytime soon. The U.S. may not have direct support for STC anytime soon, but it is in the U.S. national interests to improve relations with Saudi Arabia, especially faced by threats advanced by Iran and possibly backed by Russia and China on that front. Before we end up new Saddam regimes in the region. I use this metaphor, an example, very strategically. We ended up with a Saddam regime that required more resources to get rid of. And that could have been prevented, and we could end up with a new Saddam regime in northern Yemen with ballistic missile capabilities, with a central bank, with influence over trade routes, with, most importantly, with a hate ideology. So that is something that we keep neglecting in strategic discussions. But there are only certain countries or certain regions in the entire Middle East that have an official hate ideologies in their curriculums, in their schools, in their media. Definitely the Hamas-led Gaza Strip is. Hezbollah's enclaves in Lebanon is one of them. Hashd al-Sha'bi in Baghdad and in southern Iraq has been advancing a hate language and a hate culture. Same way, we don't have much studies about how the education system in Yemen operates under Houthis, but we have enough reasons to believe that there's hate education in that country towards the West, towards Israel, towards communities, vulnerable communities as well. We have seen videos evidences that school children are forced to chant anti-Israel, anti-Jewish slogans. So the question is, what will be the implications of this? That is what I mean by ending up with a Saddam or a Ba'athist regime, because we have seen this in the past. We're likely to see it again.
And David.
Yeah, if you remove the Iranian overlay, the situation, I'm not naive enough to believe that everything goes away in Yemen. There's other issues and so forth that still can drive much conflict. But there's a particular angle, which I think Chang was getting at, Samir were getting at, that Iran brings to the table. And the ideological, apart from the military, but also the geostrategic complexity, also the ideological. Iran is a cult of death. They worship death. I saw one of the Hamas leaders the other day saying the difference, and he was saying this with pride, the difference between the Israelis and them is the Israelis worship life and they worship death. And he was saying that with great pride to show how weak Israel is. This is the cult, essentially, that Iran brings to the table. And when you put that ideological toxicity inside Yemen, issues that could be resolved or could be at least managed become unmanageable and unresolvable. So really, I think the strategic regional game, it's not a game, I mean, it's a grisly affair, but for lack of a better word, the strategic game is really what will make the situation in Yemen move toward a different place eventually. In the meantime, I think there's no way around it. The United States has to find ways to work with the Saudis, the STC, and I think also, the Israelis may begin to play a more active part here, if even quietly and under the table. But I think everybody feels they have their backs against the wall in a twilight strategic struggle, and that struggle has to first be resolved to Iran's demise, rather than and that's really the sine qua non of moving ahead.
Great. I'd like to thank everyone. David, Chang, Amir, thank you. I feel this was a fantastic and very illuminating discussion. I'm on the same page with all of you. The Islamic Republic is the one that fills this hate-filled ideology that we see running through. And once you squeeze that toothpaste bottle, it's tough to put it back in. And they've indoctrinated generations upon generations of this with this martyrdom. And we see it. I've worked with groups, Yemeni groups at the UN Human Rights Council. I've seen the atrocities that are committed upon the Yemeni people. And it's no different than what we see taking place in Gaza, taking place on the streets of Iran as they are protesting over the last year and a half against this barbaric regime. So great insight from everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And any closing comments from Chang, Amir, David?
Thank you so much.
No,